Hello and welcome to this episode of T-Tech. Today we're going to talk about dual booting and why we need it and why it's important. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the normal circumstance without dual booting. So normally in our computer, we have our persistent storage here, and there's a basic input-output system, and that's stored on a ROM chip. So that's our read-only memory chip. And that brings the computer on enough to start all of the hardware connected to it and test to make sure the hardware is working. And after it does that, it then looks on the hard drive for a specific part of the hard drive called the master boot record. And on newer systems, this is also a GPT type. And essentially, this is our partition table. So that is on our hard drive, and it's the first information on whatever storage we're using. But what it holds is something called a bootloader. And this bootloader knows how to look for a kernel. So the kernel is a part of an operating system, and this bootloader loads it for us. So in step 3, once the bootloader finds the operating system on our disk, it goes ahead and starts to load the kernel, and then the kernel then loads all of the user land. So all the utilities that are in the operating system for us to use. So normally though, we only have one operating system on our computer. Okay? So this is without using any type of dual booting. So if we want to use more than one operating system, how do we do that without dual booting? It's not quite dual booting, but it's kind of a hybrid in between version. So this works on a desktop, a laptop, or to some extent a tablet and phone, at least the dual booting part. We have two storage medias in this case, number 1 and number 2, and they're both 250 gigs, so gigabytes. The thing is, I would have one that had Windows installed on it, and I would have another that had Linux installed on it. So if I wanted to run Windows, I would put like this here. If I want to run Windows, I would put number 1 in my machine, and it was a laptop in this case, and then it would boot up, and I had my Windows. But if I didn't want to run Windows at that time, I ran number 2. So I'd take the laptop apart, I'd put the second drive in there, and then I'd boot up Linux. So that was how I did it for a long time before dual booting. And it's a good in-between method because it minimizes the risk of damage to your computer. But with dual booting, and this is what we're actually going to achieve, the advantage of this, is we can have one 500 gigabyte disk, and this doesn't matter even if it's an NVMe disk or any other newer technology that may come out. The idea is that we have more than one operating system on our computer. That's all it means. So it's the same steps. We have our basic input-output system, or our UEFI, that doesn't really matter, or our MBR GPT. Once we get to step 2, though, that's where things change a little bit. And what changes is that we have a menu. And a menu will come up after we install a bootloader, and it will have us pick between our first OS and our second OS. And depending on what operating system we choose in this bootloader menu, or the boot menu, we can boot operating system number 1, if you follow the red arrow, or operating system number 2 if we follow the green one. So again, this is where I could put Windows on number 1, I could put Linux on number 2. You can even take it further and do a triple boot or a quad boot, where you could boot something like Windows XP, Windows 10, and then you could boot Linux, and then for your fourth one you could boot maybe OpenBSD. So that would be like a quad boot scenario. But normally, it's an easy way to have 2 operating systems on your machine and be able to switch between them at will. So something that you need to understand is this bootloader When you install Windows, Windows doesn't have the only other operating system Windows will boot is another version of Windows, and that's just by design. But when you install something like Linux Mint or any other Linux distribution, it installs bootloaders like Grub. And Grub can detect different kernels on your hard drive, so on your storage, whatever that is, and it just makes those entries. So what you have to understand is not all bootloaders can boot multiple kernels from different operating systems. So one last thing as well. This, where we have two portions, these are two separate partitions, so two separate slices or areas of this one 500 gig drive in this case. So you could have a 300 gig drive and split it up, 150 and 150 as well. But these are two separate partitions. Now, we could, in theory, have an operating system on a separate disk and boot that, but it's much easier to keep it all on one hard drive because remember that bootloader has to have access to these disks. You can do it like that, having two separate hard drives, but I would really recommend that you just have one. But with this, though, we can choose between two operating systems, and one thing that will happen when you try to install and dual boot for the first time, and then you can't boot something like Windows, maybe from where you started from, usually what has happened is either the bootloader has not detected Windows to give you an option to still boot it, or you've installed Linux first and installed Windows after, and then, of course, it cannot boot Linux or another OS, and that doesn't give you access to that, so it just boots into Windows. Well, when that happens, I want you to realize you'll still have your information as long as you didn't overwrite the partition that had Windows on it. So you can actually go into Linux and repair the bootloader and reinstall it. And then it will detect your operating systems. So that is something you can do if you have an issue where you can't boot Windows after trying to dual boot Linux as well. So we're going to quick run through a demo, and I'm going to show you what it looks like from Linux Mint when we have a Windows machine and we want to dual boot, and how we go about that. I'll see you in a second. Alright, so now that we're in our live environment, so we went ahead, this is if you make an installation media of Linux, and we booted it up. Now, we already have Windows on this computer, and what we're going to do is just to show you, let's go ahead and pull up the disks on this machine. And this is one of the great things about Linux. You can not only do things like partitioning, but you can recover information. So this is a little bonus. You can mount this partition, which is our Windows NTFS partition. So not only can we dual boot Linux and Windows together, we can go ahead and recover data off our existing partition if something on our computer breaks and we can't boot up that hard drive or whatever that media is we happen to be using. So this is the idea though. And what we're going to do now that we know that we can dual boot, we're going to go ahead and install Linux Mint. And we're going to look at how we can choose what part of the drive will be for Linux, so the Linux operating system, and what the other part, our Windows operating system, what percentage of it that it will be able to have. So I'll see you in a second. Alright, so let's go continue. And I'm only going to take you up to the partitioning part because after that it will install and, that won't be all that. It's not the focus of what I want to talk about in this video. So we're just going to accept the defaults here. And a normal Linux Mint install is very easy. It's very straightforward to do. Now I'm just going to hit continue just for simplicity. But coming up in a second, we'll be able to choose where on this disk we want to install Linux Mint to. And again, the awesome thing about this concept is it doesn't matter if it's a USB stick It doesn't matter if it's an external hard drive. It doesn't matter, if it's a different form factor hard drive. Like, we started out, there was things like IDE interfaces, and then we had, SATA interfaces. Now there's NVMe interfaces, all these different things. So going forward, these concepts will still hold, though. You'll still be able to partition a drive, it doesn't matter if it's an SSD or whatever, and have more than one operating system on one computer. And just choose between it. So this is the most important part. So if you are doing this and you are getting your feet wet with Linux, and you want to keep your Windows, so in this case I have Windows 7 here, keep that option checked. Install Linux Mint alongside Windows 7. This makes another area of your drive, so another section, a partition, and it will only install Linux and all of its files in that portion of the drive. But the Windows portion will stay untouched. So any programs, any files you have there will stay safe, because this will not mess with that. It will only erase information if you choose something like this option, or if you do the partitioning manually. So make sure to always choose this here if you're getting your feet wet with it. Or you can do what I had done, 2 separate hard drives and put one in or the other. But we're going to keep that option and hit continue. But you can slide it back and forth here and just choose what you want to have. All right? So once we choose that there, we can then install now. So that will go ahead and install it on the drive. Windows will have its own partition. Linux Mint will have its own partition. But Linux Mint, in addition, will install a bootloader that's going to scan all the partitions on the hard drive and be able to load it will do what's something called a chain load of Windows, or, and again, make sure that this is what you want before you do this real quick. It's good, so we're going to hit continue. It'll chain load into the Windows operating system, into the Windows bootloader, and then it will boot up Windows, or it can boot up Linux. So I will see you when this is done. Alright, now that our installation is complete, now we have what's called a dual boot. So we can boot Linux Mint here, but it also scanned the disk and found another operating system, which is Windows 7, and this we installed alongside of. So if I want to, I can boot Windows 7, and it will start to boot up Windows. And then it starts to boot up a Windows on this machine. So that will start keep booting up into Windows, and then I can access that OS and use it like normal. And as well, I can restart and boot up into Linux, and I'll show you that in 1 second. So now instead, I can also boot up into Linux Mint as well. So then this will start up the Linux Mint OS on our computer here. So that's how dual booting works and why it's important, and why you might want to use it, and some advantages of even using Linux to look at your Windows partition to recover data and things of that nature. So as always, it's been Tyler with T-Tech. I do hope this video helped you, and thank you for viewing, and have a very nice day.